Hey everybody, quick little intro before we get started. What you're about to watch is the first in a series of videos about the Iliad. Now I know this is not at all going to be a big view grab, but I don't care because I'm super excited about it. I think this can be a good collection of videos for people who want to learn more about this book. So if you know anybody who's interested in this kind of thing, I hope you'd be willing to share it with them. Also, this isn't going to start with a standard introduction that explains how the Trojan War starts and all that kind of stuff. So it might be a little disorienting at first. I'm going to just throw you right into the action, which is why I decided to record this introduction. I'll catch you up on all that at the beginning of the second video where we cover book 2 because that doesn't have quite as much going on. So anyway, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on the other side. Our story opens on a beach. There's an armada of ships pushed up onto the sand, lined up side by side as far as you can see down the shore. And before these ships, countless thousands of men are milling around between tents, campfires, stashes of weapons. It's a grand display of power projection and the greatest military undertaking in history. But if you look a little closer, you'll see that all is not well. Some of these fires are bigger than the others, but bigger in a sickly-looking way, with streams of thick black smoke streaming up to the heavens. Zoom in a little closer and you'll start to notice then choke on the rotting stench. Even closer and you'll see with horror what these fires are. Piles of burning human bodies. So what's going on? How did we get there? And why is this where the story starts? Well, I'm glad you asked, even though I guess you didn't. So stick around because this is book 1 of the Iliad. So to answer your or my first question, the reason the story starts like this is that the Iliad begins in media res, or in the middle of things. There's absolutely no reason for you to know the Latin phrase unless you're pretentious or have a professor who's going to put it on a test or something. All you really need to know is that sometimes a book or movie or whatever will start you in the middle of the story instead of at the beginning, usually to grab your attention by putting you in an intense or action-packed scene. In this case, to answer your or my second question, we start 9 years into the invasion of Troy by the Achaeans. Think of the Achaeans basically as the Greeks. It's an alliance of Greek city-states coming to attack Troy because Paris took Helen. I'll get into more of that when we do book 2. We are also 9 days into a plague. So I guess they like starting you 9 days or years into something. I don't know if there's some kind of symbolism there or whatever, but that's what they do. So men are dying just left and right. Everything's terrible. It looks like the Achaeans are either going to die or just going to have to kind of pack up and go home. When finally their greatest hero, Achilles, just decides this is enough. So he calls them to an assembly and says, we got to get this sorted out. It seems understood that this plague was sent by Apollo. And so Achilles suggests that maybe they could ask a prophet what they did to make Apollo mad and what they could do to fix everything. And what do you know, there is a prophet there named Calchas. He stands up. Great, we might have an answer. Except he says he's afraid to talk because what he says might make some really powerful people angry. Achilles says, hey, look, man, you're good. Say what you need to say. You have my protection. I don't care who it is. I'll stand up for you, even if, get this, it's Agamemnon. And if that wasn't coming on strongly enough, he calls Agamemnon the one who claims to be the greatest among us. So it doesn't seem like Achilles is exactly trying to navigate this situation diplomatically. In fact, you might be forgiven for thinking he's kind of itching to fight the big dog. Anyway, Calchas gives his prophecy, and turns out, what do you know, it is Agamemnon's fault. See, here's what happened. The Achaeans had raided a town, and they took a bunch of loot. And by loot, I mean, objects, treasure, along with people. Now, they divided it all among the Achaean leaders, and Agamemnon, among other things, got a young woman named Chryse. Now, this wasn't a problem in and of itself, because it seems like wartime atrocities are just something you do in the Iliad, but where Agamemnon crossed a line is when Chryseis' father, Chryse, and don't blame me for these names, I didn't make them up, came and asked for her back. He was a priest of Apollo and brought a ransom and everything, but Agamemnon was having none of it. He just said, get out of here, old man, and don't let me see you sneaking around my camp anymore. I'm not giving you your daughter. And by the way, he threw in there just as a little barb, I'm taking her back home and she's going to grow old with me. So the priest shuffled off crying and prayed that Apollo would shoot a bunch of arrows into the Achaean camp. Apollo did just that, and his arrows manifest as a plague, which is what got us where we were at the start of the story. Now, the story actually tells us this at the beginning, but I withheld this information so you'd learn it along with the other characters, kind of start everything as a tense little mystery. But this brings up an interesting question. Why did the Iliad not do the same? Why did it instead tell us Apollo shot the arrows into the camp because of this offense, depict the big mystery where the Achaeans don't know why they're suffering a plague, and then have a prophet come in and re-explain what the story had already told us in the beginning. It seems a little clunky, right? The Iliad is using repeated exposition scenes to tell us the same information twice, and why did it need to do that? But for better or worse, this is actually a common storytelling convention within the Iliad. It's often repetitive, and I've heard it say that within the Iliad, everything is in the foreground. What does this mean? It means that the Iliad does not emphasize or de-emphasize things for the sake of focus. If there's a reference to or even an understanding of an event, say Apollo shooting arrows into the Achaean camp, then it will flatly tell us about it, every single time. It will not just allude to things. It will not withhold information for the sake of mystery or tension or drama or anything like that. If it's there, it's going to explain it to us and explain it thoroughly. And so this means that sometimes you're going to hear information repeatedly. And we'll see more examples of this, especially with side characters as we go on. Now, this seems a little nonsensical and can be tedious to modern audiences. That's why I'm explaining this to you and maybe kind of cutting things out from time to time instead of telling you or reading to you the whole story beat by beat. That would honestly get a little bit old, and that's why a lot of people haven't read the entire Iliad. But in order to understand this, you have to see the Iliad as a product of its time. It did not have the same storytelling goals as, say, modern movies or novels. It wasn't trying to tell us a tight, concise story. Also, it was told by a bard. You would never sit down and read the Iliad, at least originally. It was written and read eventually. But at first, this was something that was meant to be sang as a performance. A lot of this repetition would help both a performer remember what they are doing and also help the audience to keep up. If you think of this as a song, that also helps too, because a lot of this repetition would be like repeating a popular refrain in a song. If there's a part of a song you like, you don't just hear it once and it's over, as you would expect in, say, a movie or a book. And so if you think about it that way, that might help understand what this audience was experiencing and why they did this. Also, the Iliad was kind of a repository for cultural knowledge. The story itself is kind of a framework that contains all this knowledge. So people at that time, they couldn't, go to the library and read a book. I guess, I don't know if anybody does that anymore now, or they couldn't get on the internet to find information. So these traveling bards, by memorizing a lot of different information about a lot of stories and characters and heroes, and compiling into this one framework of the Iliad story, they would pass on this information, and that would be how a lot of people locally could remember it. There is a structured plot, but within that plot, there were a lot of subplots and episodic parts and stuff like that. So maybe one way to look at it would be less like a movie or a novel and more like a TV show, where there was a story arc, but within that story arc, every book of the Iliad would kind of be like its own episode of TV. Might be another way of looking at it. So it might help you to appreciate the Iliad more, or know which parts to skip, if you understand that it was never meant to progress with the efficiency or focus of a novel. Anyway, after prophesying what caused the plague, Calchas explains what needs to be done to end it. In short, Agamemnon needs to give Chryseis back to her father. But this time he can't even accept a ransom. In fact, he needs to send an offering with her to her father. Agamemnon does not like this one bit. He screams at Calchas, "You only prophesy bad news at me," and so on, and says he really likes having Chryseis around. She's his favorite woman even more than his wife. Ick. But even more than that, and I think this gets down to the core issue, if he has to give her up, he'll be the only Achaean without any loot after the last raid, and that would be just a total affront to his honor. Achilles says, "Yeah, I get that, but there's nothing left to give you. We've already divided up all the plunder, so you can't take anything from anybody else, right? Just wait and we'll make it up to you later. We'll give you even more after our next attack." Now, if Agamemnon was already heated, this really got him going. "I see what you're up to, young man. You just want to keep your prizes for yourself." And he was not going to have that. So he agreed to send Chryseis back to her father, but he made it crystal clear that after he did, he was going to take something from one of the other Achaean leaders to make up for it. Maybe Odysseus, maybe Ajax, maybe you, Achilles. Well, now this really gets Achilles going too. He says in no uncertain terms that would be just a super unfair thing to do, and says that he's been here fighting for Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus this whole time. This whole war was over Menelaus' wife being stolen, by the way, but we'll get into that later. Basically, this is starting to feel like Achilles is digging up some old resentments. Like, I have no issue with the Trojans. I'm not here for me. I've been fighting this war this whole time for you. And so if this is as ungrateful you're going to be, then maybe I should just leave. Agamemnon's like, "Yeah, fine, maybe you should leave. I don't care." But then he adds that maybe he'll replace Chryseis with Achilles' prize, a woman named Briseis. So yes, along with Chryse and Chryseis, we also have Briseis. Again, I didn't make up these names. Then for good measure, Agamemnon says that'll show you who's actually the better man, and says that he's making an example of Achilles to show everybody what insubordination will get them. Basically, mess with a bull, get the horns. And that's essentially what this conversation's all about. To put it crudely, it's just a giant pissing match between Agamemnon and Achilles, with Agamemnon, the established leader, trying to assert his authority, and Achilles, the young upstart, vying for a little status himself. Look at it maybe as a confrontation between the coach and his star player. Now today, we might think the solution to this is pretty simple. Just back down and let the other guy have his way over this one little thing. Be the bigger person. In our society, that makes you look reasonable and maybe earns you a little social capital. But back then, it was not a viable option. It did not make you look like a bigger person. It made you look small and weak. Basically, it's an irreparable stain on your honor. And since your honor is everything, backing down basically reduces you to nothing. So by saying, I'm going to take Briseis and there's just nothing you can do about it, Agamemnon put Achilles in an untenable situation. He couldn't just stand there and take being humiliated in front of everybody, but Agamemnon had pulled rank, so what could he do? Well, the only thing that would enact and help him maintain his manhood. He reached down and started pulling out his sword, with the goal being to use it on Agamemnon if we weren't being clear enough. Of course, nothing good is going to come of this, so the goddess Athena rushes down and grabs Achilles by the hair to stop him. Achilles is basically like, hey, get off me, I'm going to kill this guy, and Athena's like, no, settle down, use your words to shame him instead. So Achilles does just that. He calls him a drunken sot, dog-eyed, dear timid coward, which probably hits harder in the original language but works pretty well in English too. Basically calling him out for just wandering around the camp leeching off people who do most of the actual fighting. Then he says, I'm out of here, have fun. You're going to miss me when you're being torn apart by Hector and the Trojans. It's at this point that a guy named Nestor steps up. Now Nestor is the oldest of the Achaean heroes, and his job is to give wise advice and basically make super long speeches. We'll get into that more later. In this case, he tells Agamemnon and Achilles that he's fought alongside better men than them, and he carries on for a minute about all the things he did back in the day and says that he and some of his guys used to fight mountain centaurs and stuff like that. So basically, if guys as great as that can listen to me, then maybe young whippersnappers like you two can too. And that's what he does a lot. He's always talking about what he did back in earlier times and relays older stories, and he does it in really, really long speeches. Sometimes it sounds silly, but a lot of it is just, again, this story used as a vehicle to pass on cultural information. We'll get into all that more later. But the point is, in the end, he tells Achilles to chill out and accept Agamemnon's leadership, and then tells Agamemnon not to take Briseis from Achilles. Don't be such a tyrant. Of course, this accomplishes nothing, because if there's one thing you should know about Greek mythology, it's that the heroes never listen to warnings from old people. So Agamemnon just says, how can I let Achilles get away with being insubordinate? How can I be a leader if I put up with this stuff? And Achilles spits out, I would be a coward to back down from somebody like you. And he says, go ahead and take Briseis, but come back to my ships looking for anything else. And that's going to be the end of you, Agamemnon. Essentially, I see this last parting threat as Achilles trying to hold on to whatever honor he can, even though Agamemnon just totally humiliated him in front of everybody. They bark back and forth for a while, and when they finally dissolve the assembly, Achilles goes back to his ships to not fight, and Agamemnon sends Briseis back to her father, or gets the process started. There's a lot of description of his men cleansing themselves ritually and of loading the oxen up on ships to go over for offerings, but we won't describe all that. Instead, we'll skip forward to where Agamemnon's men go to get Briseis from Achilles. He's actually pretty nice about the whole thing. He tells them, hey, cheer up, you're just the messenger, I don't have any issue with you. So he's, putting on a good face. But as soon as they leave, he runs down to the beach and starts breaking down and crying. And he calls out to his mother, Thetis. And what do you know? Pretty soon, Thetis rises up out of the sea and goes over to sit by Achilles. Now, it will be helpful at this point to point out that Thetis is a sea nymph, basically a minor goddess. Nymphs are usually associated with something in nature like the sea or a river or a tree or something like that. It also might be helpful to remind you that the Iliad is meant to be performed as a song, because Achilles spends almost 40 lines of the poem repeating the entire story up to this point, almost beat for beat. It's not something you'd expect from conventional storytelling today, but it makes more sense if you see it as a refrain being sung by a bard from memory. He even opens up by telling her, why should I explain this to you, you already know, which sounds like a wink at the audience, but I'm not sure. Finally, he gets to the point and asks his mother if she can go up to Zeus and see if he might be able to help the Trojans win against the Achaeans. So it's not just enough for him to sit out of the battle. He actually wants someone to sabotage his own allies so they can be really sorry that, Agamemnon mistreated him and he's not there anymore. And he thinks his mom might be able to do it because even though she's a super minor goddess, she once helped Zeus in a rebellion from the other Olympians. And so, maybe he'll be able to help in return. Thetis starts off by crying about how Achilles is fated to die in battle, which is one of her main jobs in this story, but in the end she agrees to help. She just tells Achilles that he's going to need to hang in there and resist the urge to fight for a while because all the Olympians just yesterday left for a big feast in Ethiopia, so they're off in a far-off land where nobody can reach them, and so she won't be able to go get any help until that time. Don't ask how Athena noticed that there was something going on wrong just a few scenes before and raced down to stop Achilles when they're out of communication in a far-off land, whatever. So anyway, Thetis leaves and the scene shifts to Odysseus. You know Odysseus, right? The one from the Odyssey? Well, this is the first time we actually see him in the Iliad. We'll see him from time to time. In this case, he's taking ships full of cattle and men, along with Chryseis, to go over to Chryse and return the girl to her father. There's a whole lot of ritual here. It talks a lot about the sacrifices. There's conversations between Odysseus and Chryse. They also, show feasting and dancing and singing and stuff like that. A lot. We're not going to go over all that in any kind of detail. But the short answer is this makes Apollo happy, and so he ends the plague. So that's all great. Odysseus sails home, and everything's good except for the fact that the story mentions Achilles is still at home sulking, or still back at his ship sulking. So fast forward a little bit, and 12 days later, the gods are back home on Olympus. So Thetis rushes up to meet with Zeus. She finds him sitting outside on a craggy peak of the mountain, and she throws herself before him and asks him to fight on behalf of the Trojans. Zeus just sits there quietly. He doesn't say anything. He seems a little awkward. And finally, Thetis is like, "Hey, dude, at least give me some kind of answer, right?" And Zeus says, "What kind of trouble are you trying to make for me here?" See, Zeus's wife Hera is a pro-Achaean god. Almost all the gods of Olympus are on the sides of one army or another, and Hera is very much pro-Achaean. In fact, she's the one who had given Achilles the idea to have the assembly. She's also the one who sent Athena down to stop him from killing Agamemnon. So she's very pro-Achaean. And so Zeus is like, she's so in favor of the Achaeans that even when I'm neutral, she always accuses me of siding with the Trojans. So imagine what's going to happen if I actually do something to help them. And this is kind of a typical situation for Zeus. Throughout the Iliad and just Greek mythology in general, there's always a lot of drama on Olympus. And Zeus is constantly trying to tiptoe around it, always stressed out about who's going to nag him next. And all the gods are nagging him about one thing or another, but especially Hera, who doesn't like him for a variety of reasons. But he can also be kind of a softie if someone asks him nicely. So in the end, he just sighs and says to Thetis, "Fine, I'll help, but just hurry and get out of here before Hera sees you here. She might suspect we're collaborating." So Thetis does take off. The text describes her jumping straight off the top of Olympus and diving all the way down into the sea, which is a pretty cool visual. And then Zeus goes inside to meet the other Olympian gods. Problem is, I guess he didn't rush Thetis off fast enough, because the moment he walks in, Hera storms up and says, "Who are you scheming with now?" and accuses him of doing things in secret. Zeus says, "None of your business. I'm the king of the gods. I have a lot of business to take care of, and sometimes I have to do things without telling you every little detail of what I do." But Hera's like, "Come on, I barely ever pry. I'm just nervous that you were, I don't know, outside plotting with Thetis to devastate the Achaeans and glorify Achilles." And this is kind of a strange thing to say, right? But this is basically what the text has her saying. She doesn't say she saw Zeus out there, certainly not that she heard the conversation. She just expresses a suspicion. But then she describes in way too much detail everything they were talking about. And this is just another example of how the Iliad puts repetition in the mouth of the characters. Like Achilles, Hera is just repeating things we already saw. The weird thing is she's repeating things that she didn't see. She has no way of knowing all this detail. And this just reinforces how much a lot of these speeches are vessels for repetition or exposition as much as the actual words of the characters. But anyway, this conversation starts to become heated, with Hera pushing Zeus and Zeus getting more and more agitated until, to put it bluntly, he threatens to become violent. He starts by saying that pushing my buttons is a dangerous thing to do, and eventually comes right out and says, if I decide to put hands on you, there's nothing that all the other Olympians together can do about it. Hera sits down, but there's still a lot of tension in the air. When the god of the forge, Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, he limps out onto the middle of the floor and tells his mom basically, chill out. You don't want to mess with Zeus. It's not that he's on Zeus's side. It's just that he knows how dangerous Zeus can be, and he doesn't want to see his mother, hurt. He tells a story about how, well, first he emphasizes that yes, Zeus can take on all the Olympians together. That's part of Greek mythology, at least depending on the story you're reading. But then he also relays a tale about a time that they were in a similar situation. Zeus was about to get rough with Hera, and Hephaestus intervened, and Zeus threw him off Mount Olympus. Now, a couple things about this whole encounter. First, yes, this is a horrifying and disturbingly casual account of domestic violence, and we'll get into that more later. Second, I didn't say much about Hephaestus, but stories about him vary quite a bit, and I want to touch on that a little bit here, just because it's a good example of how Greek mythology just isn't consistent. There are a lot of different traditions, and they all merge together. For example, this scene alludes to a tradition about how Hephaestus was thrown off of Olympus by Zeus because he intervened in a fight with Hera. And it's implied, I don't know if it's said, that that's where he got his limp, because he was thrown off the mountain and injured. Falling from Olympus down to Earth, I guess you fall for like a full day, and so the fact that he's a god is the only reason that he was injured but not killed. However, there's another story where Hera is the one who threw him off of Mount Olympus, and she threw him off the mountain because, get this, he was ugly when he was born. So I feel kind of bad for Hephaestus. He's kind of a pitiable character. He's the only ugly god among the Olympians, and he gets treated kind of poorly because of it. I won't get into that too much now. But even within the story about Hera throwing him off Olympus, there's variation there. In one version of the story, it's because he's ugly and she throws him off, and that's where he gets his limp. In another version, he's actually born crippled, and she throws him off because of that. Even his parentage is up for question. According to some traditions, he's the son of Zeus and Hera both, which I guess would make this story look a little different. And in others, Hera gave birth to him all by herself to get back at Zeus because he gave birth to Athena all by himself. She jumped out of his head, by the way. That's how he gave birth. But the thing is, for every bit of background information I give you in these videos, or that's presented in the Iliad itself, you can find conflicting information out there. Some of it might be bad internet information, and some of it might be true. So be prepared for, me to seem wrong, or for the Iliad itself to seem wrong based on something else you found. And that's just because the myths aren't consistent. Sometimes I might just be wrong. I'm not going to say that is never going to happen, but, myths just vary, and so expect that. And sometimes there might be variations in the story I don't acknowledge, and I just can't stop and acknowledge everything. So I guess just chill out and roll with it. There's one thing also you need to be prepared for, and that's the fact that the Iliad never mentions Achilles being invincible everywhere but his heel. That's one of the more popular traditions about him, one of the things most modern people associate with him. That's where the term Achilles heel comes from. But the Iliad never mentions that. He's just kind of generally referred to as a great warrior. Students always question me about that when I taught Greek mythology. That's one of many things they were surprised about when we read the Iliad. You'll find out more later. So I just thought maybe I should get that out of the way so you're not too disappointed. Anyway, to wrap things up, Hera listens to Hephaestus and stops fighting with Zeus, and everything is peaceful. The gods settle in and have a really happy feast. Hephaestus, eager to please, limps around pouring drinks for everybody, and everybody laughs at his efforts. So he did a good job, he made them all happy, but everyone's going to laugh at Hephaestus, right? We pretty much have a happy ending, at least among the gods. They all make peace and they're all good for now. And the closing scene has Zeus and Hera climbing into bed together, though not necessarily that way. And so that's where book one ends. This isn't going to be the end of the video. There's some more analysis about book one, just tying a lot of things together. Unfortunately, my neighbor chose to use a chainsaw outside my wall all day long until just a couple hours ago, and I wasn't able to start recording as early as I would have liked. He was out there cutting down our green belt. Great. But I will start recording later, and you'll see this pretty much instantaneously, I guess. So I'm back and ready to talk about some of the bigger ideas in book one, especially as relates to what we'll see throughout the rest of the Iliad. And notice that I'm dressed differently so as to indicate the passage of time. There are four main things that I want to cover real quick here. First is the structure of book one. It shows us two parallel conflicts, one among humans and the other among gods. These conflicts are very similar, which I guess is why I called them parallel. Each is set off by a parent appealing to the gods on behalf of their child. Each involves two characters, one in power and the other thinking they're being treated unjustly. And in each case, someone steps in to try to calm things down, mostly by telling the subordinate to submit to authority. So what do you know? Ancient Greeks were in favor of the status quo. The big difference, of course, is that the gods listen to this advice while humans ignore it. So, pretty standard lesson in human failure versus divine wisdom. It's also worth pointing out that the divine conflict follows from and is caused by the human conflict. This is how it usually goes throughout the Iliad because the gods are very interested in the affairs of humans, which makes sense because these stories were written by humans and their idea of the divine is going to reflect their own concerns and obsessions. Second is what the escalation from human to god conflict shows us, which is that people's conflicts are way bigger than they are. Book 1 pretty much immediately dives into this idea. Basically, when you think about it, the whole thing is about individual human grievances getting out of control. Whether it's Chryseis wanting his daughter back or Agamemnon and Achilles fighting over their personal honor, because that's really what their argument was about more than women, each character sees the wrong done to them. It feels like justice should be as simple as fixing their problem and punishing the person who wronged them. But it's not that simple. Society is full of a lot of different people with a lot of different interests, and justice is a very complex issue of balancing all those interests against each other. So when you give one person what looks like justice in isolation, you might set off a chain reaction that stops a lot of other people from getting what they want and maybe what they deserve. For example, the story seems to be indicating that it was right for Chryseis to get his daughter back. But it also shows us that this resolution disrupted the social equilibrium of the Achaean army by unbalancing the equal distribution of loot and honor. Take that away and somebody has to be dishonored, which simply doesn't work in an honor-bound warrior society, which is why you end up with a rift between Agamemnon and Achilles. So how do you handle that? That seems to be the core problem posed by the Iliad. It's constantly sorting out these questions of how you get justice for an individual without tearing apart the fabric of society. The fact that this is a bigger philosophical problem, something that society in general needs to untangle, seems to be represented by the escalation of this conflict to the gods. Sure, on a literal level, all the gods have their sides, and so the conflict goes up there because they all want their sides to win. That's literally what happens within the story. But this seems to be indicating on some level that these issues need to be sorted out on a higher level of ideas, and what higher level is there within this theological framework than the realm of the gods? So I think that might be partly what they're going for there. Now, it's definitely worth pointing out that the way the Iliad approaches these problems is barbaric and often repulsive. The Achaeans openly behave like war criminals, going around looting towns and taking women for their use. And the story never represents this as a problem. Because remember, what set off the offense in the beginning was not that the Achaeans had captured these women and had taken them back to their camp. It was that Agamemnon had shown disrespect for a priest when he came to get his daughter back. Also, it's not shown as any problem at all that Zeus threatens and apparently has performed violence against his wife. And then, we kind of see his son telling her, hey, mom, just chill out, don't get dad angry. And when she does chill out, that's shown as a resolution. Not super duper cool. So what do we do with this? Well, we can recognize that these are problems while also appreciating that these characters are operating in the early stages of civilizational and moral development. Their values are objectively worse, let's not be at all vague about that, but they also have less to work with than we do. We can think of it in terms of a question of whether our technology is better than their technology. Our technology definitely is objectively better, right? But we're not smarter or better people because we have access to this technology or produce better technology. We're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants. We have more to work with. So just as we can appreciate that they were, working with technology they had at their time, we can also understand that they are working with the moral principles they had at their time. And we can appreciate the baby steps they were taking toward forming a society that could work together and helping people live side by side with each other, while recognizing that maybe we wouldn't necessarily want to be friends with most of these people in the story. Third, we should look back at how the gods interact with humans across Book 1, because this will definitely prepare us for the rest of the story. We have Apollo shooting arrows into the Achaean camp, Hera giving Achilles the idea to call the assembly, Athena stopping him from killing Agamemnon, and Thetis having a conversation with Achilles and taking his complaint up to Zeus. Also, I guess Apollo stopped shooting arrows after Chryseis' return to her father, so that's technically something that happened too. Now notice that most of these are just a god interacting privately with a single person. And by that I mean nobody else can see or hear the god. The reference to Hera giving Achilles the idea for the assembly is totally abstract and almost nothing, just a passing reference to him being inspired, almost like an obligatory thing about inspiration coming from the gods. Now the scene where Athena comes down to stop Achilles is much more concrete, but it only involves him. Nobody else can see or hear her, the story is very explicit about that, and her physical action is pretty minimal. Yes, sure, she grabs Achilles by the hair at first, but her ultimate action is just to convince him not to kill Agamemnon. so she could easily be seen as the voice of reason within his own head. His conversation with his mother Thetis, even though it is kind of graphically magical, what with her rising up out of the water and floating over to him and stuff like that, is an entirely private one, and all she does is hears his request and agrees to go up and talk to Zeus. So basically, when it comes down to it, this is just him sending his prayer up to the gods. In all these cases, the gods are acting basically like what a non-religious person would think the gods are, a voice in someone's head. And this is how they behave through most of the story. If a god wants to say something to everybody, they don't come down, tower over everyone, and shout their message. They whisper something into someone's ear, and that person proclaims the will of the gods to everybody else. If they want to get involved in combat, they don't do the obvious thing and just stomp around the battlefield devastating the enemy with their godlike powers. They whisper a word of inspiration into a hero's ear, or maybe give him a surge of strength or something like that. Basically, most of what they do is subtle and can be interpreted for something more natural. Say in the example of Achilles, him just realizing on his own that killing Agamemnon would be stupid, or in the case of an inspired hero, just a warrior having a sudden surge of adrenaline or an exceptional day of fighting. Now, of course, you probably noticed that Apollo's actions stick out like a sore thumb in all this, because he doesn't piddle around with whispering things in people's ears. He just straight up starts shooting arrows into the Achaean camp. But of course, even this is still open to interpretation, because the Achaeans don't see an actual god shooting actual arrows at them. All they see is a plague. So the commonality here is that we have human characters seeing mostly natural phenomena and attributing the supernatural to it. Like seriously, you could read this as a story about supernatural humans where the gods are mostly metaphors, and it would still make sense. I'm not saying you should entirely read the story that way. I'm not saying that, the gods are just metaphors and that's how you should see it. But if you keep that reading in the back of your mind, it makes the story kind of interesting, and I think you see another layer to how it was intended. But regardless of whether Apollo's actions are kind of opaque to the human characters and can maybe be interpreted as just a plague or whatever, we're still stuck with kind of a strange fact, which is that his actions are way more direct and way more effective than those of any of the other gods. It's one thing to give a character a certain inspiration, to give him a certain idea. That's fine, but what Apollo did, whether it has a natural interpretation or not, just totally devastated the entire Achaean army in one blow. So why don't all the other gods do that, I guess is the question, right? On top of that, all the gods are partisans. They all have sides. We'll get into that more a little bit later. Almost all the gods are on one side or another that's conflict, and they all want one side or the other to win, and that's why they're intervening. So if Apollo had this ability the whole time, and Apollo being a pro-Trojan god didn't want the Achaeans to win, why did he not do this before? Why does he only do this in response to a transgression, and then why does he stop when the Achaeans give sacrifices? If he wants the Trojans to win, I don't know. So why is this, I guess? Why do the gods have all these abilities that they just don't use if they're that invested in this war? And the answer is, I just don't know. But I guess if I wanted to come up with some kind of answer, it would probably be that the Iliad is a collection of cultural traditions compiled into an oral performance, and the ancients just weren't as invested in, methodical world building and consistent plots the same way we are. Again, this is just another kind of story than what we're used to. And finally, fourth, I want to briefly talk about how the Iliad opens. So yes, I am circling back to the beginning here. And sorry if that's a little awkward. I originally had this at the start. I was going to incorporate it in my retelling, but it seemed a little long, a little detailed, so I thought I'd save it for the end. For those of you cool students who are going to really appreciate it. So if you're still here, congratulations, you're one of the good students and ultra cool. Anyway, the Iliad opens with a line, "Sing, goddess, sing the rage of Achilles, son of Peleus." And this opening is called an invocation to the muse, which was a ritual of calling on a muse, a Greek goddess of inspiration, to help you tell the story. Now, on one level, there's a religious component to this. You're asking the gods for help with your performance, because remember this was originally sung to an audience, as well as acknowledging that you're not doing this alone. The gods are speaking through you, you can't take the credit. But on a more practical level, this serves to tell the audience what's coming up next, almost like a thesis statement. But it's kind of an extended, elaborate thesis statement that's maybe a little like an onion. It has layers. It starts really general, and you peel back one layer after another layer, and it gets more and more specific. Or if you want to think about it visually, it starts off at a distance, and as we slowly zoom in, we get more and more specific and eventually get to the action. And I'm sorry for the mixed metaphors, but I think both of those kind of help us to see what's happening here. So our first line, "Sing goddess, sing the rage of Achilles son of Peleus," tells us this is a story about Achilles being angry. Then it tells us more about that anger and its consequences, teasing out fairly graphically that his anger is going to cause a lot of people to die, with a twist at the end being that this is all Zeus's will. Now, whether this is meant to specifically reflect that this is something Zeus wanted versus just being kind of a ritual acknowledgement that things happen as the will of the gods is kind of unclear. The Iliad is full of a lot of formulaic language like this, and we'll get into that more as we go on. Say that a lot. From there, it zooms in a little and tells us what set this anger off, which is that Agamemnon argued with him. But then this only brings up another question. Which of these gods got these two men fighting? It finally identifies this god as Apollo and tells about how he sent down a plague after Agamemnon dishonored one of his priests. And suddenly, before we know it, we're actually in the narrative of the story. The Iliad just kind of eases us in there, and from this point, we're just right in the heat of the action. It's subtle and kind of clever, and I just really like it. Anyway, I didn't know where to best put that without interrupting the flow of the rest of the video, but it had to be covered, you know? You have to explain what the invocation to the muse is, and I thought it was worth showing how the Iliad opens its story. There's a lot there. So that was book 1 of the Iliad. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, please like, comment, subscribe, share with others who might be into this. And again, this isn't a really good view-chasing thing, but I think it'll be good to have this out there. There's not a lot of really good methodical approaches to the Iliad online, at least that I've seen, and so I hope people enjoy this. Anyway, have a good day, everybody.